Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is T. Ames, and I'm so excited to present our final Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion volunteer training for the month of May 2024. So this month's topic, we're going to be talking all about active steps towards building and sustaining community and allyship in theater. So let's go ahead and start. All right, so agenda for today. We're going to start with introductions. I will review what we talked about in our April session. Then we'll go on and talk about allyship, a little bit about what we talked about last time, and then adding on to that definition. And then we'll talk about actionable steps towards actually building and sustaining that allyship. And then we'll pause for questions and dialogue as well. All right, so like I said, hi, my name is T. Ames. I use they, them, theirs pronouns, and I'm the education director here at Live Arts. I graduated from Oberlin College with a BA in theater and Africana studies. I have taken several workshops with theater intimacy education, as well as collaborated with Dr. Kelly Palmer of Idea Minds and Matthew Reynolds of Matthew Reynolds Consulting. So it's been really great to be able to learn so much from those folks, and then continue to learn as I grow and work in this position. I also served as a Black history teacher for 2 years at a local high school here in Charlottesville. And I curated my curriculum specifically with a DEI lens in mind, and then used Black history itself as a case study when teaching my students. I also served as the faculty DEI coordinator for 1 year at that school as well. So I have been in this world of DEI for a minute now, and it's really exciting to be able to share those things with you. All right, session guidelines. So I ask that all participants please mute themselves during today's session. There will be time at the end so we can talk and ask questions and really figure out what's going on and ruminate on the things we're learning. I absolutely encourage you to take notes. Each participant will receive access to this recording afterwards, but just know that while we're going, it's really important to just process as your body needs you to and as your brain needs you to. Listen for the sake of comprehension and not response. That can be really difficult sometimes, especially when we're dealing with what we would consider sensitive topics or uncomfortable topics. It's important to be uncomfortable. It's also important to be able to check in with yourself. So embrace any sort of feelings that end up coming to you in any way, shape, or form, and know that those experiences and that perspective that you're having in that moment is incredibly valid. So that's why we're taking notes. That's why it's important to listen, because things are coming up that you may not have talked about or don't talk about very often. So the more time you can take to be able to check in with yourself and figure out where your brain's actually at, the better. And again, we can talk more about that when we get into the questions and dialogue phase of today. All right, so let's review from our last session. I have my notes as well, which is why I'm looking down. So we have been talking for the last few months all about this idea of progress, right? And what progress is and why it has been labeled in the way that it has in American society. So these Western ideas of progress create a distinct binary in our society of agents or people who have power to maintain the movement of progress forward versus targets who systemically have had power used against them or potentially can impede that progress depending on who you ask. Usually an agent would say that they would be impeding progress. And that agent target dynamic can be implied any and everywhere when it comes to Western society. And when I'm talking about Western society, I'm talking about the society that America was born out of, right? So the society of colonization, the society of European countries going into indigenous places, and then bringing their culture, their society, their rules, their government systems, and then bringing them into those worlds to then create a broader sense of the Western world that came out of Europe. So America is a part of the Western world. That's what I'm talking about when I say Western. Speaking of that, because we are in theater, these agent target dynamics of those who have power used against them and those who use that power against others becomes incredibly amplified in theatrical spaces, mainly because we all care so much about what we do that we get so intense about the work that we're doing. So those sorts of dynamics become even more intense and can really impede the work that we're trying to do. Then we start talking a lot about white supremacy and white supremacy culture, and how white supremacy culture has been synonymous with American culture or Western culture since the United States was formed, right? So we were talking last time about the Declaration of Independence and how they were really talking about when we say all men are created equal, we were really talking about those in places of power. Historically, those are cisgendered, white, heteronormative, able-bodied, rich, land-owning men. That's usually who we're talking about. And so because of that, because those are the people who were in that room at the time when that document was written and signed, that is who we're really talking about when we say all men are created equal. And that's really where white supremacy culture began in the way that we know it today. So tenets of white supremacy, so the things that help white supremacy flourish and continue in our society, include things like perfectionism, defensiveness, fear of open conflict, and belief in one right way. So this idea that we are actively working against community building, actively working against sustaining any sort of system where equity is the goal, because white supremacy is so deeply ingrained in who we are as a society. And so because of that, it is hard to actually ascertain or achieve true equity, because we are so focused on the things that have created, the things who have made us who we are today as citizens of a Western world, right? So when we're talking about DEI, when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you cannot have diversity without inclusion, because you can include people and yet still not honor them for who they are. And vice versa. You cannot have inclusion without diversity as well. So when you have all three elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion that are actually being engaged and sustained all at the same time, that's where true belonging is. And belonging is where community can start, where community should start, because that means we're all working together to make sure that we all feel like we belong in a space. We all belong within that society. Okay, so we asked this question a couple of times throughout this entire series. And finally, we're going to ask it again. How much of your thinking is your thinking? Meaning, how much of the things that you've learned about our history as a country, about our culture, about how the world operates is based on who you are and your experiences versus the things that have been told to you, the things that others have fed to you in some way, shape, or form. And again, doesn't mean that everything you've heard is a lie, but it does mean that we need to start questioning what's going on. And we'll get more into that questioning phase later. So this is a little bit of review, but also adding on from last session. The idea of allyship and why we all need to be talking more about it and focus more on allyship is because allyship in and of itself is an active, consistent, and mostly and sometimes arduous practice of unlearning and re-evaluating where we are, who we are, and why we're doing what we're doing. So in that process, a person in a position of privilege and power, aka an agent, seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group, aka a target, right? So if you haven't noticed, that definition goes completely against what we've just been talking about as far as Western society's ideas of progress and that binary of agents and targets. So allyship seeks to try and get rid of those positions by making agents do the work that needs to be done, because targets have been doing the work for centuries, depending on what sort of target we're talking about. And I repeat this later in the slide, but I'm going to say it now. Remember that there are always going to be parts of your identity that identify you and classify you as an agent. And there will always be parts of your identity that will classify you as a target. And what's really important to remember about that is that that means we all have the capacity to be allies. We all have the capacity to do better, to use our privilege in whatever way, shape, or form we may have it to then help targets, right? So the example I always use, and I'll use it again in this moment, is that I clearly have identities that identify me both as an agent and as a target. So as a target, as a Black person, as a queer person, as a non-binary person, systemically and historically, those identities would make me a target because of how those communities have been they've been treated in Western culture. and continue to be treated in Western culture. It's getting better, but still, I still am a target in a lot of ways. And also, I'm a college graduate. I have a full-time job. I have health insurance. I have access to a lot of other things as well that would identify me as an agent. So in those ways, I can be an ally to others. Versus being a target, that would be the ways in which agents could be an ally to me. And we'll talk more about that idea of how to be an agent and why it's important to classify yourself as an ally versus a target in certain scenarios. So who do we decide is an ally, right? How do we go about saying, oh, this person's ally, this person's not? Number one rule about allyship and identifying allies is that it is only up to the target to identify who an ally actually is. I'm going to say that one more time. It is solely and independently up to the target group to decide who is an ally. Does not matter who you are. It doesn't matter how great of a person you might be. If you, in a certain scenario, are considered an agent and not a target, you cannot identify yourself as an ally. A target must identify you as one. And here's why. Allyship is an active verb. Allyship is constant. If you are an agent and you are seeking to be an ally and seeking to be identified as an ally, it is not enough to just call yourself one. You have to work towards that title. I'm going to go back a slide so we can see what we just talked about. Oh, right? This idea of allyship being an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating. Unlearning and reevaluating. We just spent the last few months talking about all of the things that have made us who we are as a culture, as people who participate and thrive and survive within Western culture. It has taken centuries for us to get to where we are and to be this ingrained in the systems at play. So for an agent who is starting that process or trying to continue that process of unlearning and reevaluating, it doesn't make sense for them to be the ones to identify them as allies because they're not the ones who need the help. If you're identifying as an agent in a certain scenario, it is your job to then help those who are considered targets, right? So by definition, an agent cannot identify themselves as an ally because the target must be the one to identify them because that's the one they're trying to help, right? All right, going back to this slide. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit just to sort of help connect these dots. So agents must work towards the title of allies, and then it's target's job to identify an ally. So to identify an agent as an ally. So if a target feels like you are actively doing the work to help them in that moment, then you may be considered an ally if they identify you as such. So for an example, during the Black Lives Matter protests that have taken over from 2016 to 2020, right? Depending on which movement of the Black Lives Matter you're talking about, what stage of that movement you're talking about, there were a lot of white folks who were agents in that scenario who considered themselves allies for X, Y, and Z, right? This next point I'm about to talk about, performative allyship, is incredibly easy to fall into. Why do I mention performative allyship in this particular scenario, in this example? Because I don't know if y'all remember, but all over Instagram, all over Facebook, all over Twitter, all you would see, especially in 2020, were these big, large Black squares. And sometimes the hashtag or sometimes the caption will be hashtag BLM, hashtag Black Lives Matter, and it'd just be a black square. And the idea was that this is supposed to be a blackout on social media. And that blackout was supposed to bring awareness to the Black Lives Matter movement and awareness to police brutality and what has been happening to Black folks for centuries. The issue with the blackout was that there was no action being taken. It was a simple gesture that unfortunately was pretty empty. It's a pretty empty gesture because again, how much of posting a black square is unlearning and reevaluating privilege and power? How much of that is actively helping a target in that scenario? And again, agents and targets are not a monolith depending on what you're talking about. So it's not up to you to say, oh, well, one Black person said that I was good, so we're good. No, that's not how that's supposed to work. Allyship is consistent, it's constant. So for a target to identify an agent as an ally, that agent needs to be doing the work consistently and arduously and constantly, unlearning and reevaluating their power and privilege and their place in that, and then how they can use that power and privilege to help a target. So posting a Black square, while it might bring awareness, is not actively about unlearning and reevaluating power and privilege in that moment. So an ally does more than post a Black square. That might be part of that. That might be a small part of that, but there's more, right? That there's grassroots developments. There's being on the ground with folks during the Black Lives Matter protests and riots and making sure that they had food and water, making sure that they were protected by police. You constantly saw in 2020 barriers of white people who create a line of folks who were standing arm in arm between police who were trying to arrest protesters and Black people who were protesting. That is a massive act of allyship because they are actively putting their bodies and their lives on the line to protect those who do not have that protection by themselves because of the color of their skin, because of how they've been treated in America and the Western society as a whole. So I know I'm sort of rambling on, but I just wanted to make sure to give you a clear picture on what exactly we're talking about and why it's so important for allies to do the work and not just say they're doing the work. And we'll get into these next couple of slides to actively talk about how to go about being an ally and sustaining yourself in the work of allyship so that you would be considered and identified as such by a target group. All right, actionable steps working towards allyship. Step one, question everything. Okay. Generally speaking, this is how we learn, right? When we question things, we learn more. So this idea of having deep curiosity for the world and people around you, it goes an incredibly long way in this work. So simply by taking the time and the energy, if you have it, because I know right now we're all spread a little thin, but that's why this work is even more important. Taking the time to identify and understand where these problems came from in the first place. So taking a step like watching these videos, because this is talking largely about how we got to this point as a society, right? Doing your research to identify and understand where we're coming from, and understanding the who, the why, and the how of the systems that have been at play that try and keep us separated as a society. So again, remember that there are parts of your identity that will always classify you as an agent and parts of your identity that will always classify you as a target, right? So it's important to understand both of those sorts of dynamics when you're doing this research. So understanding not just your place as an agent potentially, but also the place of a potential target as well, and vice versa, right? So the who, the how, and the why of how we got to where we are and why we're at where we are, and who was a part of that, who was a part of making these rules and sustaining these rules. As you're identifying and understanding and doing this research and questioning what's going on, lean into the discomfort. This is something we talk a lot about in intimacy education within theater, is that theater has never been about comfort. I think we make it about comfort because it's something that it was an easy place to sort of fall into. But theater in and of itself is not about comfort because we tell uncomfortable stories all the time, all the time. And those uncomfortable stories are what help us learn the most because it's putting audience members in a position where they can start questioning what's going on around them because of that discomfort that they're feeling, because questioning leads to effective change. That's the first step in that effective change. Hence why it's the first step of working towards building allyship, right? And building community through allyship, questioning who you are, why you're in the position that you're in, and how you got to the position that you're in. And not just you as in the person watching this, but you as an agent group or part of an agent group, or you as a part of a target group, right? So again, Make space for how you're feeling. And as you're feeling those things, continue to lean into that discomfort. Continue leaning into asking those questions and developing and sustaining that curiosity for what's going on in the world and how we got to where we are as a society. Step 2, consider and acknowledge. We're going to consider and acknowledge 4 major things. And again, these things might happen out of order, but this is the order that makes most sense in my brain. And this is how it was taught to me as well. So step 2, we are considering and acknowledging 1, your power and privilege and what access and control that affords you in your everyday life. We talked about this. This is the definition of institutional power, right? Power and privilege and access and control granted and sustained over time and sustained within a society. So if you are someone who has institutional power, that means that you need to start considering and acknowledging why you have that power and that privilege. So again, this is part of that questioning as well. But also acknowledgement is different than questioning. You can question all day and all night. But the moment that you take time to acknowledge power and privilege, acknowledgement is saying, here is the part that I play in this. So step 1, question it. Do your research, figure out the who, why, and how. Step 2, oh, this is the part that I play in this. Here's what my power and my privilege affords me. So these are just some questions here to help with that process, or examples of that process itself. Do you have to question the race or gender of a character you play in a production? What power and privilege do you have if you don't? Are you often in spaces where a majority of the people in that room look, act, or sound like you? Do you have to alter your appearance, speech, or approach to be deemed knowledgeable or acceptable? Depending on what we're talking about, these are problems that that targets deal with on a daily basis. And again, there are several different ways that folks can be considered target because there are several different marginalized groups within our society, right? So you can answer this question in so many different ways, depending on how you're identifying as an agent and how you're identifying in a target within our society. The second thing to consider and acknowledge is your role in sustaining those systems at play. So once you acknowledge your power and privilege, then acknowledging how that power and privilege affords you what you have and the role that you actively play on a daily basis in sustaining that, right? The third thing is considering and acknowledging your capability of using your privilege and how that affects those who are marginalized. So are there moments in your life where you are actively using your privilege against targets? Are there moments where you can identify in this moment where you have tried to use your power and your privilege to help a target, to help a marginalized group? And then the fourth thing, considering and acknowledging the responsibility you have of making the change because you have the power to do it. Right. So just like the example I used with Black Lives Matter and the white protesters who use their bodies as physical barriers between police and Black protesters, they knew that the color of their skin afforded them amount of power in that scenario. And they knew that the photographers that were there, the reporters that were there, would get their faces in these photographs, and those things would go viral. And all people would see is a row of white people putting themselves in the line to protect the people behind them because they were actively willing to use their power and their privilege because they knew they had a responsibility in that moment to use it and that they could use it. Right? True allyship, again, is unlearning and reevaluating where you are in society and how we got there. Right? And then constantly working towards dismantling those things and helping those who are targeted get some of that power and that privilege. Right? Creating an equitable space of true belonging where diversity, equity, and inclusion work together. Okay. Step 3, sometimes this is really hard. And this is why it's also considered a guideline. Allyship is not about paving the way. Oh my gosh, it's not about paving the way. And I say that, and I'm being so dramatic about it, because I think often people think that we have to figure out a new way of doing things all the time. Whereas targets or people who have been in marginalized groups have been doing the work. They've been doing it, right? Other examples of that, women, all women have been doing the work because of how our systems of gender work in the Western society, right? Black people have been doing the work because of how race works in our society. Disabled folks have been doing the work in an incredibly ableist and isolated society since the beginning. Neurodivergent people have been doing the work to operate in a neurotypical world, right? So allyship is about joining where those marginalized folks are, wherever they are in that process, and not just saying, okay, cool, I'm here now, I can do it. It's saying, what can I do? How can I help you? Right? Because listening is such an important part of allyship, this is another reason why I say listen for the sake of comprehension and not response. Because again, there will be moments, several moments most likely, where having these conversations can be incredibly uncomfortable. But it's important to hear them. It's important to have them because that means that you're giving space and time and energy for marginalized folks to tell you their story, right? This whole series has been about DEI within theater. How important do you think it is for folks of marginalized groups to tell their stories on a stage where an audience full of people of all different backgrounds, all different levels of power and privilege are privy to hearing those stories, to being around and witnessing these stories being told, creating space where marginalized groups can be themselves, right? And then tell those stories on and off that stage, knowing that even if we don't understand, we're listening, we're here, we're present, we're actively choosing to not say anything, to just listen, to take notes, to ask questions respectfully, or do the research, go back to step one, do the research and then come back, right? Another important part of listening is working with integrity and direct communication as well. So take guidance from the people that you're working with. Take guidance from the targets that are in that space and keep your word. Keep your word, friends. Please, please, please. Massive part of listening is after you're listening, keeping that information and working with that information. You say you're going to do something, please do it, especially in this work of allyship, right? Trust is so important because those marginalized groups are trusting you with that information, or trusting you and giving you their time and their energy so that you then can use your privilege in that work as well to help sustain that allyship that we're trying to build. Step 4, direct your focus. All right, this is really hard. This is really hard, especially because when we're talking about allyship, I know, especially for me, I get so overwhelmed sometimes because I want to do everything, right? I want to be the person who's like, okay, great, I've got the information, let's run with it. When really we just have to sit back and let things happen the way that they need to happen. And by sit back, I mean, I don't mean sit back. I'll take that back. I apologize. It means focusing on one thing at a time. Instead of looking at the full picture and saying, oh my gosh, white supremacy is so massive. Oh my gosh, racism is so crazy in this country. Oh my gosh, everything going on with sexism and ableism and all sorts of discrimination. That it's horrible. What do we do about it? What's going on? Oh my gosh. Instead of getting overwhelmed, because we will get bogged down and overwhelmed very easily in this work, choose to focus on those who share your identity when it comes to building and sustaining allyship. Meaning, go to the people who look like you, go to the people who sound like you. So after you've questioned everything, after you've considered and acknowledged your power and your privilege, After you've taken time to listen, and remember, listening is a continual process. So you're going to keep going back and questioning, keep going back, considering, acknowledging, keep going back and listening. The next step is then to share that information, to go to the folks who were within that identity, the same identity that you have in this particular instance. Talk to them, because allies are responsible for engaging people who share their identity so that they can dismantle those systems together, because they have the same amount of privilege. So once you've gone and talked to folks who are part of Black Lives Matter, once you've gone and talked to folks who are disabled, once you've gone again, and this is all after research, this is all after you've acknowledged and considered your role in that, once you've created that space where you know that you can be quiet, that you know that you can just listen and sit back and make sure that you are not using your power and privilege against a marginalized group as this is happening, you can go out and share that information, right? So for example, white people, you should be engaging other white people in conversations about racism. Don't talk to other people of color about racism. They already know about racism. They've experienced it their whole lives, right? Same thing with men. Men are responsible for engaging other men in conversations about toxic masculinity and misogyny and sexism. Not women, because women have been experiencing it. They already know. Okay. It's your job to then take that information to those who don't know or those who might not know, and then continue those conversations as you continue to question, as you continue to consider and acknowledge your role and power and privilege in this moment, as you continue to listen to marginalized groups. Okay. A part of directing that focus is focusing on the task at hand, not what that task is going to bring you. Meaning, please do not expect awards or special recognition from marginalized groups. Again, everybody's tired. Everybody's going through it. Everyone is actively working towards something. Okay. And as we're achieving those goals, as we're directing our focus, as we're working through these steps to build and sustain community, it's really important to redirect any sort of attention to compliments. It's important to redirect any sort of energy where like you want the compliments, you want the thank yous. Redirect that energy for wanting that approval to continuing doing the work. Because again, allies are only allies when they're identified by that marginalized group that they are attempting to ally with, to align with. Okay. If that group calls you an ally, or the person you're working with considers you an ally, that's great. Love that. But that's not a moment to celebrate. It's not a moment to be like, yay, I did the work, I'm done. Marginalized groups, they face these sorts of things every day. This is not uncommon. Every single day. So if you do one good thing, one thing that you use your power and your privilege to align with a marginalized group, you've listened, you're focusing in, you're having those conversations with folks of your identity to do better and to continue dismantling these systems at play and spreading that information, because information is power, knowledge is privilege. Okay. Redirect all that attention, all that energy to wanting to just get that recognition. Redirect it to the groups that you're supporting and the issues that you're facing. Because again, this is a consistent and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating. It is not a day long. It is not a week long. It is lifelong. And that's why DEI work can be so exhausting, because we're all trying to do the work every single day to different degrees, right? One of my very good friends would say, I only have but so many spoons today. And when I'm done, when I don't have enough spoons, I'm done. So maybe you have 2 or 3 spoons one day, right? You have enough spoons to do some research, to look up an article and read what's going on, and do your best to listen to a friend who's already been talking about it, right? Doing your best to have conversations in that moment. But you only have 2 or 3 spoons in that moment or in that day. That's okay. That's okay. Maybe the next day you got 20 spoons. You have the time and the energy and the focus to be able to do more. Love that. Love that. I know we're all still surviving. We're all still paying bills and trying to live a life and do better for ourselves as well. But remember that in order to do better for yourself, we also have to do better for those around us. Because if we really want community, this is how we do it. If we're really talking about building community within theater, this is how we do it. Theater and the world of theater and the history of theater has been built within white supremacy culture in our Western society. To listen to actors of color, listen to actresses or women who act, depending on how you would like to identify. Listen to disabled actors. Listen to neurodivergent actors. Listen to actors who don't have the power. Direct your focus towards directors and producers and designers who do have that power. Have those conversations with them, right? We dismantle it from the inside out because we're the ones who help sustain that. And if we want to be considered allies, remember, only a target can identify an ally, not an agent. We want the actors in our lives. We want the designers in our lives. We want the builders and the volunteers who are marginalized to feel like they can come back to a theater because they are safe there, because this work is being done, because they feel a sense of true belonging, because diversity, equity, and inclusion are working together as we continue to create and sustain that allyship within those spaces. We can only do that if everyone is doing their part to do so. When you don't have enough spoons, when your spoons are done for the day, facts, heard, totally understandable. Next day, keep going. Keep going. I'm kind of going into these next steps, but just encouraging you to keep that process moving forward. Step 5, build your capacity for criticism and critical thinking. This is so incredibly important in the work of allyship because part of doing the work is being willing to be wrong. Knowing that we will make mistakes. It's how this works. We're not used to doing this work just yet as a society. This is still relatively new. Not even relatively, it is new. It is new. We haven't really been talking about DEI for a very long time as a Western society. This only started becoming important in the last decade or so in the ways that we're doing it right now. So as we're doing that work, please be honest and accountable for your mistakes. If you do something that actively goes towards, or you're actively using your power and your privilege against a marginalized group to get what you want, and then you realize that that's what you've done, hold yourself accountable for that. Because now you know better. Because you've considered and acknowledged the part that you're playing. And now it's time to hold yourself accountable for that part that you are playing. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person. Not at all, actually. It means that you are taking the time to address who you are, how you've gotten to where you are, and then how you can use your privilege elsewhere to help a marginalized group. Recognize when you're being called out for a mistake is a really good thing. People wouldn't call you out if they didn't care. People wouldn't call you back in again if they didn't care. I tell people all the time, especially as a non-binary person who uses a different name than the name I was given at birth. If people misgender me or use the different name for me, I correct them if I care about them. I correct them because I want them to know me. I want them to do better because I want to keep them in my life. If a marginalized group or a marginalized person does not correct you, they don't want to have anything to do with you. So if you're in a theatrical space and someone says something to call you back in again, and all you're doing is taking incredible offense to that, and you can't move forward, that's on you, not on that person. Because that person was trying their best to call you back in again. They want you to be there. They want you to be a part of this work. And in order for that to happen, we all have to be held accountable for our actions and our words. Right? Reflect on what you can do better. Again, you you might only have but so many spoons in a day, but so many spoons in a rehearsal period, right? Whether that's 3 hours a night or a 3-month show rehearsal process. But what can you do better in that process to be a better ally? Right? Part of building that capacity for critical thinking also is being vulnerable and aware of who you are and the biases that you hold, because that will help keep you grounded in that moment. Acknowledging that, yes, you might feel hurt or confused and embarrassed, but it is not the responsibility of a marginalized group to comfort you. Because remember, step 2, considering and acknowledging power and privilege. You're allowed to feel your feelings. You're allowed to be uncomfortable. But remember, theater is about discomfort as well, because we're telling uncomfortable stories all the time. Okay. Really important to build that capacity. It's one of the hardest steps because it is so hard to be considered wrong in our society because we feel like we are less than. We feel like we don't deserve X, Y, and Z, but you do. Important things to remember. Again, allyship is about progress, not perfection. The goal is not perfection here because perfection is a tenet of white supremacy. It doesn't help anyone. Big grand gestures are not always the goal, mainly because what are those big grand gestures actually doing versus the little tiny steps day to day that help us build and sustain that allyship? Because allyship comes from small everyday acts, right? If you say something and you realize it's a problem, apologize. Hold yourself accountable for that. Rather than, oh, I must buy them flowers, or I must do this or must do that to make it better. The simple act of an apology does a lot. And using I statements when we're apologizing, right? Because we don't want to make it about the other person doing something wrong when we're the ones who have wronged someone. Remembering that allyship occurs at an individual level and DEI occurs at an institutional level, right? So the act of building allyship and building community is an interpersonal here moment versus DEI is what an organization like Live Arts is responsible for. Live Arts as an institution is responsible for the DEI aspects of Live Arts, whereas the volunteers who come through this building, staff or otherwise, are the ones who are building that actual allyship, right? So you've got the systemic level of DEI, and then you've got the individual level of allyship. And we've been talking about this for months, but I'll say it again. This work isn't easy, friends. It's incredibly easy to get overwhelmed. Take a step back, take care of yourself. And remember, the systems that have been at play have been created and sustained over such a long time. And it takes just as much time and energy and practice to dismantle it. We are not doing it in a day. We are not doing it in a week or a month or a year. It's going to take a lot more time. But that process, again, is about moving the needle, right? More one way than the other, because the focus is the good progress of building and sustaining that community, not perfecting that process, because that in of itself would just be a part of white supremacy. And that's what we're trying to dismantle. And we've mentioned this before. All of your identities are intersectional, and that's okay. We all have a responsibility in this process. And if we're putting humans forward rather than putting systems forward first, that's how we're really doing that work. Because the person sitting right in front of you is the one who's actually doing that work. Okay, we are good to go. Thank you so much for being here. Here are my sources, and I'll make sure that y'all have access to this later. Have a good one.